My name is Rafael Espinal. I'm a city councilman from Brooklyn. So I was born and raised in a neighborhood called Cypress Hills. It's just north of East New York. And at the time that I was growing up, and probably even still today, it was one of the most disinvested neighborhoods in the city. Crumbling infrastructure, little resources in our schools. Unemployment rate was actually rising, if not at probably the highest levels in the city. But it also was a neighborhood that was home to a lot of new immigrants that wanted to become homeowners, and a lot of New Yorkers who were attracted by the low housing prices in the neighborhood. And it really gave opportunity for working class families to become homeowners. It was a neighborhood that was also in the borderline of Queens. And I remember growing up always walking into Queens, which is just a few blocks over, and seeing the dramatic difference between the disinvested East New York and the invested in middle class neighborhoods of Queens. And to go from a place that's had crumbling infrastructure to a place where all of its streets are tree lined kind of made me be aware of the impact that cities can have in neighborhoods, and why is it that a city is not investing in my neighborhood as much as they were investing in the next neighborhood. It was mostly Latino and African American. Before that, it was heavily populated by Italians and Germans and American whites who actually moved out of the neighborhood during the Great Flight out into the suburbs. When crime was upticking in the city, it was a time that they all began to leave, which opened up all of this opportunity for immigrants and working class families to actually move in. The businesses in the neighborhood were mostly 99-cent stores, dollar shops, bodegas, bargain stores, more takeout restaurants than anything else. So there was no real access to quality goods. I think that's the same in every low-income neighborhood. But again, the people who owned those stores were local entrepreneurs, which is important as well. But because of this investment from the city, I don't think the neighborhood, as in my lifetime, has had access to fresh food and produce, goods and essentials that probably were of better quality than what was able in the neighborhood. Dining in restaurants for families to go to and enjoy themselves, and even a vibrant nightlife that's important to young people growing up in the neighborhood. I was fortunate enough to be in a household where my family had enough money to buy a home and to do grocery shopping and to own a car, but that was all we had money for. But when we would go shopping, I remember we would drive out into Queens and go shopping at the bigger supermarket, only because of the access to the fresh food that was available in the supermarkets that wasn't available in our neighborhood. And that continues to be a reality today. So I'm hoping that that's what changes in the next few years. Yeah, yeah. My biggest aspiration growing up in East New York was to finally move out of the neighborhood. Brooklyn wasn't a place where your dreams can come true, right? It was kind of a place that held you back and didn't really give you the opportunity to reach your full potential. So up until I was about 19, 20 years old is when my mindset started changing. Started thinking that it's not fair that we have to leave our neighborhoods in order to get all of those great services that other neighborhoods have across the city. That we should be doing more to make sure that people who live in my neighborhood have those same opportunities. I never thought I'd be in politics. I never thought politics would be part of my life. I was actually a film major in college, switched over to be an English major, and my aspirations were to be in media and communications and in film and in Hollywood, or writing a novel somewhere, just doing something where I can use my creative and artistic abilities. So when I graduated college, I was teaching part-time, and through teaching I was able to help people in my neighborhood who were illiterate and learning how to read and write for the first time in their lives. So I got first-hand experience of what those disinvestments were having on my community and what investments my community needed. So while I was teaching, the program was coming to a close because of a lack of funding. A local city councilman was looking for a writer, and I was referred to the office, and I said, I'll do this job for a few months. I'm going to go back to school, get my master's in fine arts, and I'll just do this to pay my bills, to get through, and to make some money. That you can actually have an impact on your local community through local government. I actually learned how local government works through that office, and I remember thinking to myself, where am I ready to give up my creative side to be able to work in my community? But I also thought to myself, well, maybe I could be creative with the way I govern, and that's the direction I decided to go. It was a very unusual race when I ran for state assembly. But I have to say that my neighborhood historically has been a very socially conservative neighborhood. The church across the board played a big role in my constituents' lives. So there were a lot of social concerns that my neighborhood had that was hard for me to shake, even though I'm not socially conservative, because I was struggling with the idea of, like, is my job to come into office and do what I want to do, or is my job to represent the will of the people, right? And at the time, I did take a little more socially conservative positions on issues that were in mind for more of my constituents' voices, which in turn became me getting Democratic Party support to the Republican support and the conservative support. I've learned that sometimes you have to take a stand on positions that you believe about in the way you see it, because there are issues that have a very global, important impact that maybe your constituents don't see. And that's the way I've been governing ever since. I became a state assemblyman at the age of 27. I ran for office when I was 26. And you are a representative of the local neighborhood for the state of New York. So all of your duties and all of the bills you vote for are bills that impact the state as a whole. Education is an important area that the state has full control over, but the city doesn't. It was something that I enjoyed doing because it exposed me to actually being an elected official. It's much more political in that it's a larger body and it runs more like the federal government, where you have the assemblies like the House of Representatives, then you have the state Senate, which is like the Senate, the U.S. Senate, then you have the governor, which is like the president, and it kind of taught me how three branches of government work. It taught me how to draft legislation and see the process in a way that I've never seen before, been exposed to as a staff person. And I think that really gave me the tools I needed to come back to the city. When people always ask me, why did you go from the state to the city as a city council member? And the answer is simple. I really wanted to have an impact on a local level. I wanted to have impact on my neighborhood. I was in the state assembly passing bills that dealt with the regulation of wells. I'm like, I don't have any wells in East New York. So I felt that the city council would be much more productive for me and what I was trying to accomplish. So I ran for the city council in 2013. I was 28 years old. And with the vision of dealing with all of those socioeconomic issues in the city council, you actually have more control over the city's budget. And you can make huge investments into parts of the district that you feel need those investments. And that was my goal. I think that I've been pretty consistent in doing what I think is best, which is the way I decided to move forward with opposition from my neighborhood. There have been times I've taken positions. For example, one big bill was taxing plastic bags and charging 10 cents, 5 cents for a plastic bag. In a neighborhood like mine, which is a very low-income neighborhood, and what I felt was that 10 cents was going to be detrimental to the bottom line of my constituents' salary. And at the same time, my district was providing jobs in plastic bag packaging. And so there was jobs and there was an economic impact. There was a huge economic impact that I was considering. I think that was one of the defining moments where I was like, all right, this is an issue that my constituents don't see the long game. And this is where leadership has to step in and say, this is what's best. And I voted to tax plastic bags. And there have been many instances where I had to do the same thing. But there have been instances, for example, in my district, where we had a big rezoning plan that was proposed by the mayor to create affordable housing coming into the neighborhood, where I came out and said, well, we can't just build affordable housing here. I understand this is important. I'm dealing with decades of disinvestment and socioeconomic issues. It's time that the city steps up and makes those investments. And I was able to secure over $250 million just on investments in the neighborhood, outside of his original plan to rezone the neighborhood. those are very rewarding experiences because you're actually able to deliver indirectly on the things that originally weren't part of the plan. That's the only way you'll inspire your constituents to vote for you. You have to have a plan. You have to have a vision for the neighborhood. And if you don't have that vision, then you will fail to inspire and fail to get the votes you need to get in office. So it's important for you to understand what are the issues, how do the issues impact your constituents, and how do the issues, I think, make your constituents feel on a gut level, right? And just figuring out what those things are and creating a platform out of that and moving forward with that will allow you to run a successful campaign. A lot of the legislation that I've introduced has to do with the issues that I know my community has faced and is facing. Do I introduce legislation that's more big picture, that goes beyond my constituency? Of course, because it would also impact my constituency. For example, urban agriculture is one of those bills that no one in my district is telling me, hey, we need more farms in the neighborhood. But I know that the impact those farms can have. I know the impact that access to green space will have on neighborhoods like mine. So it's a mixture of what you're passionate about as a person and what your community needs. And being able to mesh those things in a way where it benefits your community and also benefits the community as a whole, I think it's a win-win. You have to be in touch with everything that's going on. So you have to speak to people. You have to have your finger on the pulse of your community and the city. I think that being a millennial is an advantage for me because I am in the center, as a millennial outside of politics, of these cultural movements that are happening across the city because it's part of my life as an individual. And I'm able to tap into those issues and figure out how government can play a role in help foster cultural movements. And I think that that's the position and the way I've been governing in the past year, and I hope to continue doing in the future. I think millennials can play a bigger role in government, but I think that government needs to understand that they have to play a bigger role on the issues that matter to millennials. So as a council member, every single member receives a pot of money, taxpayer money, to decide how that funding is going to be spent in your local community. What they call discretionary items because you have discretion to spend them the way you think is best. A member like myself receives about $500,000 in expense dollars, and expense means, help nonprofits run their programs and their nonprofit as a whole. But you also get $5 million in capital, and capital is funding you use to help rebuild infrastructure. Most of the time, 90% of the time, is city-owned infrastructure. And you have the discretion to decide how do you want to spend those capital dollars, what parks deserves a certain amount of funding, what schools need funding. So in a simple sense, that's the basic, right? That's the crust. But you also have the responsibility to try to get more than that, right? You have to go out into the mayor's office and make sure the mayor's office, who has pretty much infinite access to capital money and expense money, to make them understand what are the important things in your district and have the mayor also invest in those projects and those nonprofits. And then there's opportunity for you to work with other groups. And what happens there is that you end up meeting with a lot of private sponsors or private organizations that want to give back to neighborhoods. And you work with them and figuring out what are those projects they're interested in. And that way you can stretch out your capital discretionary money because they're willing to invest a piece of it and you're going to put the other piece, and you're able to maximize the investments you bring to your neighborhood. I'm a firm believer that ground-changing legislation would not move unless you have support behind it. An elected official is not Superman. You can't just come in and say, this is what I'm going to do tomorrow, this is going to happen, we're going to change the world. There's a legislative process. And the way you influence the legislative process is by building support around your idea. So having someone like the board president who represents Brooklyn as a whole, who represents 2.5 million people, adds weight to what I'm trying to accomplish. And you also would like to have co-sponsors from your own body be behind the bill, because you do need 26 votes out of 51 in order to pass the legislation. So you'd want to get 26 council members to say, this is a great idea, I'm going to support it, to show you have the votes to do it. But in order to get there and to get all that support, you need the help of the people. You need to tap into those folks who are inspired by the ideas being put forward and find that it's important and have them reach out to their local council members and say, hey, you must sign on to Councilman Espinal's bill. And that really starts garnering the support you need around those issues. That happens, yeah, but I don't sign on to anything I'm not comfortable with. You do receive a lot of pressure from a lot of places, but if your gut is telling you that's not a good idea, I truly believe that you shouldn't sign onto a bill that doesn't make you feel good. I think what's most important to me, someone who loves sleeping, is that be able to sleep at night comfortably and not have to worry about decisions I've made, but think at the positives of the decisions I've made, not the negatives or potential negatives that could happen if I sign on to something I don't feel comfortable with. There are times where you sign on to something and throughout the certain time frame, you have organizations approach you and tell you, hey, listen, this is actually going to affect us in a negative way. And you have to make the decision whether or not you sign off or you stay on, or influence the bill from being changed to a point where it's not affecting those organizations or those folks in a negative way. So there's a lot of room for changing your mind, but I think it's important for you to understand before you sign on to something the overall impact it's going to have. I don't think I've removed my name off the bill. And I think the better word for gentrification is displacement. As a result of rising rent costs and a limited housing stock. When you have people from all over the world wanting to move into one neighborhood that's probably at capacity, the natural inclination of those landlords and developers is to push people out who are paying less rent to get people who are going to pay more. So it's a supply and demand situation. So you have to take a balanced approach at figuring out how do you build more housing in a way that it's not luxury housing that's only going to benefit one demographic, but build housing that's going to be inclusive for everyone. So you also have to make investments to make sure that legal protection help is there for people who are being evicted and being harassed. And I think that those two components are important in helping stabilize and helping slow down gentrification in the city. And just let's give everybody an opportunity to be able to afford to live here and be able to live here. Because if we don't do that, then because of the limited housing stock, people are naturally going to get pushed out. When I make endorsements, it comes from the gut. It comes from how the candidate makes me feel. It comes from looking at their platform and understanding the impacts their platform will have on your local constituency. I'm proud to say that I am the only council member or city official to endorse Bernie Sanders 150% of the way. I actually endorsed him before the primaries even started. Early on, hearing Bernie speak, hearing the issues he was touching upon, hearing the impact that his policies would have on my community, one of the most invested communities in the city, I thought it was a no-brainer to come out and support him. This was a Hillary Clinton stronghold. The other day I endorsed Hillary, but early on I couldn't endorse someone because of their reputation in New York. I had to endorse someone who I felt was best for my neighborhood, and that's what came from my gut. 1661 was a bill that originally was a one-page bill, and is simply called on the city of New York and create a comprehensive policy around urban ag. And the reason we felt the bill was important was because there is no direct place where anyone who's interested in urban ag can go into to figure out what are the rules and laws and regulations that will hinder them or get in the way of them being able to create a farm, whether it be indoors, outdoors, rooftop, basement, anywhere in the city, or a empty lot. And other cities across the country were already putting plans in place, like for example Boston. It's a very comprehensive plan of the rules and regulations of creating a farm and how you can go about doing it. But the city of New York hasn't taken that position yet. So we created this very general bill with the borough president and urban ag folks and introduced it last year. And throughout the process, the city felt that we didn't need that legislation because rules are lax enough to allow urban ag to flourish. But I believe that lax rules means more confusion And lax rules means no clear direction and no incentive for people to actually get involved or figure out how to do it. At the end of the day, we didn't get the bill we wanted. We were kind of time constrained by the fact that session was ending, but I was able to push them and convince them to start with a website that would focus on community farming and also commercial farming, and allow people to actually finally be able to sit down on a computer and go nyc.gov/urban farming and find all the information they need in order to get started, and all the information they need in order to run a business. A lot of us feel that that's not enough, but I see it as a first step on pushing the city to recognize urban ag as a real thing happening. Originally, they were going to be left figuring it out, but I think at this point, it's become clear that there is very little appetite for them to take that route. So I think it's important for us to organize, bring major stakeholders into the room, and figure out what are the things we're looking for, what are the things that are getting in our way, putting it all on paper, and creating a bill that's going to require the city to abide by the rules we create and not wait on them to create rules for us. So it's going to take time. It's not going to be easy, but in my personal history and my personal experience, if we get dedicated people into a room, we can make things happen. Cabaret law is a law that has taught me a lot about government and how government works. And I say that because it was a 91-year-old law that has on many occasions faced opposition from elected officials, but no one was really successful in actually repealing it. My fight wasn't a new fight. This has happened for decades, but I felt that now we are in a point in time where the city council is the most progressive it has been, and we finally have a mayor that's probably the most progressive mayor we've had in history. That it was the perfect opportunity to introduce a repeal of a law that has gotten in the way of suppressing and oppressing New Yorkers, and historically has been racially charged and homophobic. And those arguments were arguments that I can push upon in government and talk about in government, and being able to excite my colleagues and for them to understand why it's important to repeal this law. But none of that would have been possible if we didn't have a grassroots effort on a local level yelling and speaking on how this law is affecting them and why now is the perfect time to do this. And it was 5 kids from Bushwick, and I say kids because they're my age, grew up in the music scene in New York, who've ran bars in New York, who've benefited from the cultural aspects that nightlife brings to the neighborhood. And they started organizing people through town halls and through the media and through the press on why it was important for the city to take action. So with that energy working to support my efforts in government, we were able to finally make things happen. And I think the same has to happen in order to get any sort of urban ag legislation to move forward. This place called the House of Yes. It's a cool place. They're celebrating their 2nd year anniversary now. I mean, they've been around as a DIY spot for a very long time, but now they've officially become a legitimate business, and it's probably one of the more exciting places in Bushwick. But not to leave out so many other great places like Nowadays and Elsewhere and all these other new venues that have been popping up as well. So there's a lot of great places to go. I love them all. I think my age plays a huge role in the policy I push forward. And I say that as a millennial who not only experiences this city as an elected official, but experiences it as an individual as well. And I am able to have my finger on the pulse of the cultural movements that are happening in neighborhoods that are important to millennials because they're important to me as an individual, and be able to finally bridge that gap between those issues and governments and create policy that recognizes those movements. And I am a big believer in that the only way you motivate people to vote is by talking about the issues that impact them the most. So how do we expect people to go to the voting booth if they're voting for someone that they don't feel passionate about, or voting for a system that's not really working on their issues. And I feel that through legislation that talks to them is the way to do that. And they're going to play a very significant role in how politics move forward in the next few years. So it's time government steps up and starts working on their issues. I love social media. Right now, I think one of my favorite media platforms is probably Instagram. People love photos, and people are drawn to images, and the fact that you can simply get a message across by a photo, I think is very powerful. So I find it important to express my work through interesting images, because one, that will draw the attention of people to the photo, but then also read what the photo's about and to connect them to government in that way. So I think social media is a very important tool in bringing new generation of voters into the process and showing them that government is actually working on issues they care about. I think that more and more millennials and people are watching less TV. We're watching less commercials. I don't think we see commercials anymore. Everything's streamed, easily accessible without the noise. So we must find ways to connect to voters in that way. And I think that social media is a very powerful platform in doing that. So we should start seeing more and more governments using that as a way to connect to the everyday constituent. When I wanted to be a writer or a filmmaker, it was because I wanted to inspire people. I wanted to touch them on an emotional level. So I understand the impact artists have on people in that way. And it's important to partner with the artist community because of the influence they have around their followers and work on issues that matter to their followers, because that's an avenue of engaging people who normally wouldn't be engaged. I know nightlife impacted so many New Yorkers in very different ways, and that really was an avenue to connect a lot of people to government in a way that has never been done before, I believe. And now I open my Instagram, I have musicians, I have music spaces, I have bars, all following me and staying connected to the work I'm doing, because they feel that the government is working in a way that speaks to them. Brooklyn has played a very important role in my life. It's in my DNA. At this point in my life, I don't imagine leaving Brooklyn. Those thoughts I had growing up are thoughts that I would never think about again. But I remember how they made me feel. So when I work, I make sure that I work on policies and issues and make investments that would not allow a child my age at the time to feel the same way I felt. I want to make sure that every kid that's born and raised in East New York and Cypress Hills loves being in the neighborhood. It doesn't look over to another neighborhood and wishes they had what another neighborhood has. Not forgetting that coming from an immigrant family also reminds me of the social and economic challenges that my neighbors face. And right now, when we are struggling with income inequality, that issue speaks to me personally. So I think that my experiences has put me in a position that can best fight for those issues that kind of rose to the top in recent presidential elections. 2017, I think, ended in a very good way. I would say it was a success in finally pushing legislation that I feel personally passionate about and making an impact on people's lives that I consider to be my peers. And I can look to continue doing the same. What are those issues that are impacting us today and will impact us, our generation, in the future? So I want to make sure that we are in the forefront on the fight against climate change. I want to make sure that New York City continues being the cultural capital of the world. And the way we do that is by having government speaking to those issues. So those are things I'm going to continue working on. And making sure that the city continues being the best city in the world. I want my constituents and everyone to understand that I'm working for all of us so that we can continue being proud of where we're from and making sure that government is working for us.